Hello.
Hey. How's everybody?
Good.
Doing good.
Doing well.
Good. That is a mattress in my door. we are furnishing a cabin right now, so we bought a few mattresses. All right, let's hop to it. Let's see. Okay, so today we're going to learn a bit more about HTTP requests. So like talking over the internet. And just kind of learn the makeup of what's involved in making one and what the different pieces of it are. And then we're going to dig into an API. And so we'll talk about, I know we've heard the term API before, but the most, and it's a pretty generic term that can mean a lot of things, but the most common thing people mean when they say an API is like a server that responds with data and you can like get information from it. And so we're going to look at a weather API that's available online that you all can use that I'll show you kind of how to start using. Let me actually, it's going to be easiest to learn about this through this weather API. So the weather API is just this site here. It's just weatherapi.com. And this is a website that's specifically for developers. So all the marketing for it is to coders that would want to gain access to real-time weather data for some reason. So, you're building an application and you need real-time data in it. You can use this API to be able to add that data to your application. So your application could do anything, it could be any sort of idea that might need weather data. So, when if you were writing the Google Home thing, and someone asks like, what's the weather? Like it has to go find out what that is at that moment when you ask for it. And so their backend is probably hitting some weather API to find out what the current weather is. And it's like using your location and stuff like that. Or maybe you want, or your phone app, when you pull up the weather, it's going to hit a weather API. APIs are, you're going to use them all the time, depending on what you're trying to build to get access to whatever data makes sense to get access to for whatever it is you're trying to build. So here, this is so someone might use this to gain access to weather. So you can basically sign up for it to gain access to it. And I've already done that. So I signed up with my OKCoders email. And this is kind of the screen you get to after you sign up. And a lot of times APIs like this are like paid or something like that. Usually there's like a pretty generous free tier where you can like play around with it and integrate it within your code and make sure it works for you. And then basically as your application gets more and more users, then you would start paying this API more because you're using it more. so I signed up for it. You know, there's like billing and stuff you got to set up, and then they'll have like documentation for how to talk with their API. But then most importantly, they're going to give you a key. So you can see like, here's my API key. And this is what allows me to like basically authenticate with the API whenever I talk with it. So every time I make a request to this weather API, I need to pass that key so they know who is asking for data, so they can properly bill me or like rate limit me, so I'm not like hitting it too much and things like that. So you know, you got to grab that key, and then they've got this API Explorer so that you can then go start to, you know, see what kind of stuff you can get from it. So what data can you receive from it? So they have this interactive API Explorer to make it easier for you to get going. And so they ask for my API key. So I just paste my API key in here. And then they say, you know, what protocol do you want to use? HTTP or HTTPS? You pretty much always would want to use HTTPS. And then what format do you want the data to come back in? Now, like, it's kind of funny that they even ask here. Most people don't use XML anymore. It's like it was like the original way that we typically would send data over the internet in a structured way, but JSON has been more popular for a long time now. And so the format that we want to get data back from this API in is JSON. So basically, you know, a big object with a bunch of different keys and properties in that object. And then we'll talk about this piece in a second. So then they have the different things available to me. So what data is available? Well, one thing is I can just ask for the current weather, or I can ask for a forecast, like a 10-day forecast, or I can ask for historical weather data or future. And then I don't know why sports is on here, but they're getting into sports, I guess. So for example, if we want to just know the current weather right at this very moment, then we can use the current resource that they have available to us. And then this up here is a parameter that is basically a description of where you want to get the current weather for. So you can pass a zip code, or you can pass a latitude and longitude if you want something quite specific. So you can see I'm passing in my zip code, 73106. Okay, so after filling all this in, then I can click show response. So let me just go ahead and click this again. And it shows me the full URL. So this is a URL, like, if you can see that very well, a URL like any other URL you would use to go to a web page in your web browser. So you could paste this into your web browser and it's going to return something. Normally when you paste something in your web browser, you're used to it returning HTML, like an actual web page. But like if you visit this web page in your web browser, it's just returning JSON. So there's fundamentally no difference between like visiting I'm just visiting a URL. It's the same mechanism as any other URL, but the content type that's returning is, instead of HTML, it's JSON. And so your browser, like normal, if it's HTML, your browser knows how to, you know, display all that and update the page. But here you can see it's just a big blob of JSON, which is just an object here. So you can see, you know, here's my opening brace, here's my closing brace, and here's the first key, which is the location. And then that is then another object, which has the name, which is Oklahoma City, and the region and the country and the lat and the long, and just additional, there's just, you know, a bunch of keys here with data for me. The most important key being there's, you know, the temperature. So 82.9 in Fahrenheit. They also give it to me in Celsius. Okay, so you can see here's the URL that they like they want to make it really easy for me to integrate with their API. So they've provided this web page that makes it really easy. So, they gave me the URL here. So let's talk about this URL. So the first part of the URL is the protocol. So we've got HTTPS and then : / and then we've got, does anybody remember what this piece is here? I think I talked about this at one point. Like,
The
what is,
subdomain? I don't know.
yep, this is a subdomain. And so this is the domain. This is generally, I think, typically called the origin of the URL, is this whole thing. Does anybody know what we call this piece here? These pieces?
Isn't that the version of HTML we're using? I think I remember reading like there's like 1.1 and like 2, version 2 of HTML.
Yes, so that would be like in the HTML like response if we were doing something with HTML, but this is like a part of the.
Sorry, I mean HTTP is what I thought I meant. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, so in this case, this is the V1 here, is actually specific to like this API. So like they can have like multiple versions of the API, because people like will write code that uses this API and then deploy the code. And so if all of a sudden they just change the API and like broke a bunch of people's code, that would be bad. So typically you'll see people version the API. So that if they make a change, they'll like do like V2 in the URL so that people using V1 don't immediately have that change reflected in their program. So all this stuff here after the domain is what's called the path of the URL, and the path is unique to like this API. So this is how we specify that we want to get current weather data. So this, we're sort of specifying, hey, I want to get the current weather data and I want to use the V1 version of the API is what this is saying here. And so you can see if up here I switch to forecast and show that response, you'll notice the URL, is still api.weatherapi.com/v1, but then now we're doing the forecast route. So we were changing a path in our URL to basically, the weather API has a bunch of different things that we can query, different like, current or forecast or search autocomplete. So we need some way to specify what we're asking for. And that's what this URL path piece is for, is to specify that. Let me run this again. Okay, this .json thing is kind of weird, but that's how we're specifying that we want JSON instead of XML. And then finally, there's this whole thing here at the end here, in this like, I'm sure you've all seen this before in a URL where you have like a question mark and then all these like key equals and then like ampersand and then like another ampersand. I'm sure you've all seen this in a URL, but does anybody know what this piece is called?
Parameters.
I think you would typically hear people say query string. And I think you would like technically these are the parameters, I believe. Well, you can see that them specifying parameter here. So yeah, maybe you're right. And then this is just the path. But the thing is, you'll hear people say that like there can be parameters in the path. Because notice like current is always going to specify that you want the to get the current weather data, and so it will always be that. But like this slot right here in the path is called like the version parameter, because this could be v2 or v3 or whatever. So there's like a dynamic nature to that position as well that can be a parameter. And like whether or not you make the parameter a part of the path versus a part of the query string is kind of like a little bit of an art. Because notice like they're putting these, like, so my API key is right here, and then the parameter for you can see how they're calling this parameter as well up here for the, I don't know why they just called it Q, but that's the like location is right here. So my zip code's right there. And then I'm saying no to having this like air quality data included. I don't want to have that included in the response. So there's parameters in the query string, but then there can also be parameters in the path here, like which version you're using. Usually when you would decide to put something in the query string instead of in the path is if it's like we just want to use the current weather data, but then the stuff in the query string is like modifying that same thing. Like it's like a modification to that same current weather data. So we want current weather data, but we want it in this location. And it's a bit of an art, and that's not like a hard and fast rule. Basically, all of this stuff past the domain is just like a way to specify what information you want to get back, and then also like to supply information that the API might need to be able to give you the relevant information. So we're supplying like our location, for example, like it's like input data into the API. Okay, so that's the URL. So you use URLs all the time to go to specific web pages, to go to Facebook or whatever. But you can also use URLs to just get raw information over the internet, and yeah, anyways, and they work the same. They just respond with different information. Okay, so a few other pieces of HTTP. So anytime you make a request to a URL, there's a status code response. And I mentioned these a little bit, but that's where you'll often, if everything goes okay, then you get the response code 200. So 200 okay is a successful request in response. There's other status codes like 404, meaning not found. So basically, if I change this URL, well, let me actually just make a new tab so you can see it better. So current is a specific path that they expect because they support giving you the current data, and forecast is a specific path that they expect, but they don't expect like now.json or coding.json. Like I'm just arbitrarily changing the URL. So if I do that and I send I send that request, then like typically it would say 404 not found, like that resource or that URL is not found. In this case, it looks like it's responding with, let me look real quick. Yeah, so this is giving me, in this case, so by the way, I can like on any tab, I can open the developer tools and go to the network tab here and see any request that's being made by my browser. So if I refresh this, we can see here was my request to that, weatherapi.com/coding.json, which is a URL that they didn't define, it doesn't exist. And you can see it's getting a status code of 400. So not 404, which is a little surprising to me. They chose 400, which means like user error, basically. If you get a 400 error, it's like the user messed something up. And then you can see that the response is actually still in JSON. And it's just this like object that has an error property on it. And it's saying message API URL is invalid. So every request has some sort of status code of whether it was successful or there was an error. And typically, if there was an error, they try to be more specific about it, what the error is. There's one particular error type, which you've probably seen before, which is a 500 internal server error. That just means like they have no idea what went wrong. It's just like something horrible happened, basically. And like they don't know if it was your fault or their fault. Like it's most likely their fault. So I'm sure you've all seen a 500 internal server error before, but there's all kinds of error codes out there. So you can read about that if you just search like what are the different HTTP status codes. You can get a list of all of them and see what they are. Okay, so we have our response code or our HTTP status codes, and then whenever you're talking to a particular server, you're going to, and you get a response from the server, you're going to get two pieces of a response. You're going to get the headers, and then you're going to get the body. Okay, so there's like two pieces of the response. The headers are more just sort of like metadata about the request. So it's telling you, you can see here like content type, for example. So the server is saying, hey, just so you know, the body of the response that I'm going to give you, it's going to be it's going to be JSON, like that will be the type. So there's certain response headers that are pretty important so that the application receiving the response knows what the format is. But then there's also just a bunch of stuff that isn't that important, like the date. So they're like including the date in the response for whatever reason. And then there's a few other things here that are really not important for you to understand and to be able to start working with this stuff. So here are the headers, just kind of metadata about the response, and then the actual body of the response, so the actual content that you were trying to get. And so ours response is this JSON format that we already seen, and they're just kind of displaying it for us in sort of a pretty format where they're adding new lines and things like that. And so, within the response, we would just need to go to the current key and then the temp_Fahrenheit key within that object to be able to pull out, if we were just looking for what the current temperature is. But then they also have this like condition piece as well, like the current condition, which is sunny, and then they provide like a little icon for what for what that looks like. So we can look at this icon if we wanted to and see it's this nice little sun icon. Okay, so that's like our quick overview of let me see if I missed anything. Oh yeah, okay. So that's our quick overview of the URL and like the status codes and the headers and the response. So we can use APIs on the internet to get useful information, and we communicate and get that information the same way we do with any other normal web page, just by making an HTTPS request to a particular URL. It just responds with JSON instead of HTML. Now that everything we've talked about so far has been, and everything that you've used most of the time on the internet is a GET request. So you want to get information. So I want to get, my Facebook page, or I want to get my Amazon page, or I want to get the current weather data. And so get is like the main method, the HTTP method that you use, but it's not the only thing that you do on the internet. So when you when you sign up for Amazon or you sign up for Facebook, you have to give them information. You have to give them your name and your email and your password and all that. And so there's different types of requests on the internet for when you want to give information. And that, if you're going to do that, it's called a post request. So instead of an HTTP GET request, there's an HTTP post request. And that, whenever you're doing an HTTP post request, it's actually slightly different in that you provide a body to the request. So when we were doing our GET request to the weather API, the only thing we were providing when we made the request, let me pull that up. So this request right here that we made and we received the JSON, the only thing we were providing was the URL. So all information about what we wanted to get was in the URL. And so like even the location, like it kind of seems like we're giving them data, but we're really just sort of providing like a query to information that we want to receive. And so, that's all in the URL, all that information. So a GET request typically doesn't have anything except for the URL to identify what you want to get. For a post request where you're giving information, there's a body. So, whenever we made our GET request, we received back a body in the response. But for a post request, we can actually put a body in the request. And the body in the request would be like, here's my name and my email and my phone number and my credit card or whatever, right? But the URL of that request would be like, create user, basically. So, we're hitting a resource that is for creating users, and then the body of the post request is the unique information for what user you want to create. You'll see applications make post requests in situations like that. So creating a user, or buying a new item, or making a tweet, or anytime that you're providing new information, that's going to be a post request. There's a lot more verbs than just these four, or methods, HTTP methods, than just these four that are listed here. But these are the most common ones, these four here. So the other two, there's a put request, which is just when you are trying to update information. So if you already have a Facebook account, but you want to update your height or your weight or your relationship status or something, you would do a put request for that. And then if you wanted to delete anything, so if you want to delete your Facebook account, or you wanted to delete a tweet, then that would typically be a delete, an HTTP delete method. So yeah, that is our quick whirlwind tour of HTTP requests and the kind of components within them. Any questions or anything about what I just walked through?
Real quick, I guess whenever we go to actually kind of put this in practice between the front end and all that, I guess it'll be important how we format this depending on how we set up the back end.
When you say format this, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Just like when we're writing functions or whatever it is, how we want to output certain stuff, like how we structure our objects or arrays. I'm guessing that'll be dependent on how we're, I guess, unstringifying them on the back end.
So when you are setting up your own like HTTP server on the back end, so whenever we get to the backend module and we're trying to set up something that would respond to requests, we're like the data that we're dealing with will be in JSON, like it will be an object already, or like an array of objects, or it will be something that can be easily turned into JSON automatically, just because of the fact that we're using JavaScript. So we're writing in JavaScript. And so if you have like, let me pull up. So if we have like const library, and it's an array of, yes. So great. Come on, give me another book. Thank you. All right, so if we have in the application that we're writing, so we're writing a backend, and like, when we're in the backend module, what we are learning to do is write APIs. So like we might be on the team at the weatherapi.com company writing the API that's giving people weather data. And so like someone has to write the server that will respond with, so hey, I need to define a get response for the current weather URL. And so you have to write, okay, if someone hits this URL, then I need to go run this function and do this and that, and then respond with data. So maybe you're writing this like Goodreads like website, this like library like website, where somebody wants to get back their library and show it on, you want to see it on the web page. So so their library data will be in a database, and you'll query the database to get the library data, and then you'll send that library data to the front end in JSON. And so like whenever you load it into your server, it will be in this format. It will be an array of objects, because that's just the way that we represent that data in JavaScript. And so to respond with JSON is really easy. You just call like one method, and like most of the time you don't even have to think about this, but we have that JSON.stringify method that can turn our array of objects into JSON automatically for us. So you don't really have to think about like the format of the data or anything like that to be able to respond to requests and like with the technology stack that we're using. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking.
I think that covered it for now. Yeah, I didn't know if there's like different approaches people took on how they like to structure that, like before it gets stringified and whenever it's brought back out, to make it easier to work with in different ways. It just seemed like whenever you went into their API just a minute ago, you were mentioning how nicely they laid it out. So I didn't know if people will do it differently.
Yeah, so there is like so two things there. So you as the developer decide how you want to format the data and give to the user. So like somebody decided to do it this way, and there's no like science or rhyme or reason to this format here. Like this isn't like a standard JSON request response. Like someone decided like, hey, I'm gonna have a location key and then put all the location stuff inside an object there. Like they could have easily just at the top level put name, region, country, lat, long. Like they just made a choice that it would be better organized, as a sub object, and then have a separate object, which is the actual weather data itself. So like, and called current, like it could have been called current weather, or like current weather in your location. So somebody decided here's the format, and this is what I think makes sense. But you'll often see people nest stuff like, these three properties right here are related in that it's the condition text, the condition icon and the condition code. And so instead of having, so it's nice to kind of group them together like that. So you'll see people do stuff like that. But anyways, this format of the response may not actually be the same format of how it's stored in the database. And so there is this whole sort of like design and figuring out how you want to store things versus how you want to represent them to users of your API. That is like, there is like an art there of how you want to do that for sure.
All right, cool, thanks.
Yeah. Let's see a few things in chat. Okay, cool. Okay, so with the time left, I want to show you all like how we can actually make requests to this API from Node. So we can, like so far I've been hitting the URLs of the weather API in the browser, but we can actually do it inside our JavaScript. And you can do it in the browser or you can do it on the server. So we can talk to APIs with our front end code. And then we can also talk to APIs with our backend code. Now, the thing is, there's typically your front end is going to talk to the API that you write. So your own private API, and then so your own backend, and then your backend, if it needs to do anything else or talk to other APIs, would then do it from there. So normally, like if you guys wanted to write your own web application that shows the current weather, normally you wouldn't from your front end talk directly to the weather API. You would write your own backend that talks to that weather API for you. Slight distinction, but so anyways, so I'm going to show you now talking to the weather API from Node. So from like what would eventually be our backend. Okay, so let me. Okay. So if I make a request to a URL to get data about the weather, is that a synchronous or an asynchronous thing?
Asynchronous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's asynchronous. So we're going to use we learned about async versus synchronous, and then we also learned about promises. So whenever we make the request to get the data from the weather API, that will be we're going to be receiving a promise of eventually getting that data. Because like we're going to be kicking off a process that is going to go and talk over the internet and then wait and then receive a response and then tell us that we received the response at that point. So it's asynchronous code. And there is in Node, so I'm planning on running this file from the terminal. So on my computer rather than in the browser. There is actually a there is I don't even have to import it. It is globally defined in this case. So normally when we were doing stuff in Node, we do like, const file system equals require file system. In this case, we don't have to do that. There is a function called fetch that is globally defined in Node already for us. And that's the same function that we use. Remember at the end of the last class, we made that request to the local server that I had running, and that we use this API called fetch. So it's the same API. We have that same API. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say API in this case. So yeah, this is where I'm saying people use that term in various different contexts. So fetch, the function, which is the way, like what we use to make requests on the internet is defined in the browser and defined in Node, and it works the same. So this is one of those cases where there's like not a difference between the Node and the browser. So if we want to make a request to get the current weather, then we can just use the fetch function, and then it just needs the URL that we want to talk with. So the URL we want to use is this current weather. So I will copy this. And we just put that in there as a string. So, hey, fetch the data that you get back from this URL. And if I don't pass it anything else, so if I just call fetch and give it a string, then it knows that I should do it by default, that it should do a GET request. So that's just how it's set up. Okay, so so what is the I can't hover over it. So when we run this fetch that URL, this line is going to return what? What's the type it will return?
JSON.
So it will eventually be JSON, but since this is asynchronous, what is the like wrapping type?
Promise.
Yeah. So running this line here returns a promise of JSON. That's correct in this case, because this URL is going to return JSON to us. So we can do const weather or const current weather promise equals that. So if I want to log the response that we're going to get, let me turn this off. If I want to log the response from the, whenever we get it back, what should I do here?
You're just trying to console log it.
Yeah, just console log the response.
You have to like once the promise is fulfilled, you can print current weather promise, right? Or maybe I'm saying that wrong.
Yeah. So how do I like attach to when it will be fulfilled?
Is
There's
it
two-
dot then?
Yeah, dot then. Yeah, good. So there's two ways, right? The first way we saw was with dot then. So this promise, current weather promise, if we want to do something whenever it's done, so like the callback sort of thing. So we use dot then. So dot then, and then we receive as a, like we have to pass dot then a function. So we have to say, hey, here's the function that's going to do whatever I want to do then, like whenever it's finished. So we have to provide then a function, and it will receive the response for us. And so then we need to do something with the response. With fetch, there's the response itself, which is like the header and the body. Because remember, it's not just the JSON we're getting back. Actually, it's like it's a response that has like the metadata headers and then the body. So if we want the body, we have to kind of pull the body out of it. And so that the way that looks is we do this response. So assuming that the response body is format JSON, then this function will work. It will pull the JSON out of the body. So that's the first thing so this piece here, it's kind of funky looking because we're like returning response.json, but that will pull the JSON body out of the response. And then after we've done that, we can then actually have the JSON. So then we can here do console.log JSON. And this kind of did that nice formatting for me. All right, so remember if we do a multi-line, I didn't need to actually, so let me just get rid of that. If you do a multi-line arrow function, you have to explicitly return, but I don't need to do that in this case. So and you can chain, we can do this sort of chaining, this dot then. The reason for that is, so we have our this is kind of hard to understand, I know, but we have our request to get a response, which is a promise. When we get the response back, we pass this callback that receives the response and then pulls the JSON out of it, which you have to kind of set up this way, because this is actually also a promise, which is a little weird. I'm not sure why you have to do that, but so calling this .json method is also returning a promise. So we then have to then that thing as well. So that's why this like chaining is happening. All right, so once we've done that, we will console log the JSON. So we can now run this program and see it giving us a response. I'm going to actually pull out. So if I want to just console log, so if I just want to log the current temperature in Fahrenheit, what do I need to do at this point to pull that out?
You just,
JSON.
yeah, good.
I was just gonna say JSON.current.temp_f.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now I can, actually, I'll just do it in here. So I can open a terminal in VS Code, and it will be in my current location. So I can move to module 3, and then move to day 7. And then my weather.js file is right here. And so if I want to run it, I can do node weather.js. Oh, hold on, what version of node am I? Okay, so they added the fetch to node later. They added it in version 17. So I'm on 16 at the moment, so I need to switch. So I'm just gonna do that now. Okay. So I switched I have like a program installed that makes it easy for me to switch node versions. And so I just switched to node version 18, which is probably what most of you have whenever you installed it. And then now I can do node weather.js again. And yeah, look at that. So we've got like this terminal program here that just, when we ran it, it logged the current degrees in Fahrenheit, which I don't know, that's pretty cool to me. Okay, that's the main stuff I actually wanted to show for today. So any other final, oh, actually, we should just refactor this real quick to be, so there's the 2 ways that we can deal with promises. There's the .then style. And then there's the other style, which is the async await style. So to modify this to the async await style, we would make a function marked with what?
Marked with async in front of
Yeah,
it.
so yeah, async function, you know, get weather or get current weather. And then we would, I'm just going to copy some of this and just have it happen twice. All right, so here, whenever we've, actually, let me just, usually you'll see people do like const URL equals the URL you want to hit. Because usually URLs are kind of long and they kind of take up a lot of space, so that people will put that in a variable and then just call fetch and pass it that variable. All right, so now that I've got this async function, I can then use which keyword inside the function.
Await.
Yeah, await. And so fetch, whenever we run fetch, like we said before, it returns a promise. And so inside an async function, you can await the promise. So you can just like immediately unwrap the promise piece of it, so that you're then just dealing with the request. So we can do await. And so then that would just be the current weather response. And then we would do const JSON equals, and in this case, we have to do await again, current weather response dot JSON. Because so notice like up here, and I'm gonna hover over this stuff, and it's gonna like VS Code's gonna show me the types. So when I hover over line 2, which is just, you know, we're not inside an async function, we're just in a normal JavaScript line of code, and we call fetch. Notice it's telling me that the type of this variable that I'm declaring is promise response. So it's, you know, you're seeing it telling you it's a response wrapped in a promise. Whenever I do this down here inside the async function and I hover over current weather response, notice it's just response. So it's not wrapped in promise. And the reason for that is the await. So the await is the piece that's removing that promise aspect of it. If I remove await here and hover back over this, you'll see it's now a promise of response again. So that's what await is doing for us. Now, this response has a method on it called JSON, which does that work of reading the body and converting it for you. And this method, whenever you call it, returns a promise of whatever the content's going to be, which in this case, it doesn't know exactly what it's going to be. It's putting any. So it just could be anything, which is, it just sort of just means like it could have any sort of key. It could be an array, it could be an object. It just doesn't really know, because it doesn't know like the API that you're talking to. But this returns a promise though. So we also have to await that. And so we await that and get our JSON, and then we would do our console log. So this here, this function here is the equivalent of the, you know, the lines of code here. And so most people prefer this style here with the async rather than the .then stuff. But if we want to kick this off, we then need to run that function. So I will comment out this promise here and comment out this, and then just call this function to kick off the request. So let me just run this again down here. And see it, you know, worked exactly the same way, went at the same speed, like it's, you know, the same thing really. This is just a cleaner version that we prefer dealing with asynchronous code and promises. Okay, good. All right, so that's all I wanted to go through for today. There is no more additional homework. So I'm sure all of you could take a breath for a second before the last class and potentially catch up on some stuff that might have been confusing. We definitely just covered some very advanced concepts that a lot of people find quite difficult. So don't worry too much if this has been one of the hardest moments in the class. It definitely is. Yeah, and on Saturday, so Saturday is the last class, we'll be in person, and we'll just be going through exercises that hopefully solidify all this stuff for you. Okay, any last items or anything?
I just had a really quick question.
Yeah.
When you originally did that current weather promise and you had the actual API and the fetch, then you separated it again, like you separated the then chains. Can you just make that one big chain to like to the fetch? Like do the fetch and do the dot then the dot then?
Yes. Yeah, so I didn't need to assign it to this variable here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. And that's correct because like assigning something to a variable is almost, you never actually need to do it. Because like this is the thing that is the promise, right? And so like if you replace what that is with the promise, then you can then immediately dot then that. It's the same concept as like if we have like an array, and then we wanted to do like const filtered array, and then we would do like test dot filter and do number 2 number mod 2 equals 0. So like we're calling this filter method on the array. Well, like we can call that directly on the array. Like we can call dot filter right up here. Because it's the array that has that thing. It's not the variable. And so just like we called dot then on this variable up here, but we could have called dot then directly in the fetch. But normally people do assign stuff to variable just to like break up the code and make it cleaner and like to just like kind of name things as they're doing it. So you're not going to just like infinitely chain all your code. You typically will assign like different intermittent steps to variables and name them well.
Got it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I had a quick one on your .json method where you left no argument. Could that also be used to pull metadata? Say if you're like trying to generate like a sales receipt after someone made a transaction instead of getting it from somewhere else, could you just pull when that request was made? Like
Are you
the
talking
date
about
and
like
time?
there was like that date in the
Yeah, all the header information.
yeah, so if we want comment this out. If we want to see the headers, we can do the console log current weather response dot headers right here. So let me log that.
Okay.
Yeah. And so you can see before our console log with the current weather, you can see here are the headers. And so you can see date right here.
Okay.
So you could pull it from there. To pull it out, I think you would do headers dot date. Let's see. That didn't work. you know, you have to actually specifically get it like this. You have to get date like that. So yeah, now you can see the date.
Okay,
It's being locked here, yeah. But yeah, I mean, you could use that date if you want to, but typically, like if you were wanting to timestamp something, you would probably just use your own date. You'd probably like be running this method and then would be doing something like const current time equals new date. Because you can make your own date, just like and like when you do this, so I haven't talked to you guys about this date type in JavaScript yet, but this is how you generate a date that has the exact current moment in it. So if you run this method, it's going to return to you like right then, like that moment. Whenever.
okay.
Yeah.
Is that just based off the system time,
Yes.
whatever it's
yeah,
running
so-
on?
Yeah, so I can console log this current time. And we'll see like the server's time and then my time. And so theirs is formatted a little bit different because it got stringified to be sent over the web. And then mine is like this special JavaScript version. Let me turn it into a string. Okay, so I can get mine into the same format as this, but basically here was the one for the server in GMT. And then mine is also, you can see, is in GMT if I convert it to this ISO string, which is like an international standard format. But how do I get this to be? Yeah, there should be a way for me to show it in my time zone, but whenever it's logging to the console, it's converting it to like the ISO standard time, which is typically 5 hours ahead. But yeah, you can see, you know, here's my system logging the current date, like just based off the like computer's system time, basically. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay. All right, thank you all. Yeah, again, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I get it. And we'll try to make it all solid on Saturday. So see you all in person on Saturday. Yeah, have a good rest of your week.
Thanks.
Back at you.
Thanks.
See you Saturday.
You too.
Thank you.
Yeah.